I think we're in a bit of a downturn right now, at least compared to the incredible energy that we've seen, over the last decade on the left. And historically, when socialists have found themselves in a downturn, it's often because they've been beaten. And usually when they've been beaten, they've been like exiled or jailed, and they've had a lot of time for reflection. And we should be grateful that we haven't been exiled or jailed, but we should actually be engaging in reflection, like Ben said. So I agree. All right, so I was asked to speak about non-reformist reforms, which are also called structural reforms. I apologize for the terminological confusion. The truth of the matter is that we haven't actually come up with terminology that everyone likes for this concept. So I think I'll use them interchangeably. They basically mean the same thing. So first, I want to start by saying that I think that this is echoing a lot of what Ben said as well. There's really kind of an unfortunate misconception on the radical left, stemming from some of the traditions that are rooted in the 20th century that didn't make much sense in their own context and don't make much sense today. But wherever it comes from, there is a kind of unfortunate misconception about reforms that's worth addressing first. So the idea is this: basically, if you're serious about revolution, then you shouldn't waste your time pushing reforms, because those reforms are only going to defer the revolution that we should actually be fighting for. I think we can all agree that it is going to take a total, revolution in the textbook, definitional sense, in our economic and our political life in order to solve society's problems like poverty and war and climate catastrophe and so on. But of course, if it were easy to effect a revolution, then socialists would have effected a revolution a long time ago. What we actually need is mass numbers of people to make this revolution. How do we get people on board? How do we build our forces? How do we consolidate our gains once we've actually made them? And how do we accelerate toward a radically different society? Those are the questions that are actually facing us. One concept that is useful, it has been useful to me in answering this question, is the concept of what the Austrian socialist intellectual Andre Gors called non-reformist reforms. He also called them structural reforms. I've written articles about non-reformist reforms and structural reforms. I'll just use them interchangeably, like I said. First, I'm going to say that, socialist advocates of revolutionary change to our political economy have long argued that the answer to how to do this is to engage people in struggle. You have to get people out on the streets fighting for things that actually matter to them. Otherwise, they won't get out there and they won't risk their neck for them. And B, are going to meaningfully advance the struggle if won. And there's like a sub point on A that I want to make, which is that ideally we need to be getting as many people out as possible, because that's going to be the source of our power, which means that it's also really critical to think about like who these, reforms are sort of targeted at. And ideally you want the broadest swath of society as possible to be overcoming their differences and joining together in solidarity, which is going to mean something like universalist program design, which is actually not a consensus on the left today. So, but it's my position, and I think it's a logical one, and I hope that it'll be taken up in a different session. But in any case, you need people to get out on the streets fighting for things that matter to them. But B, like I said, you need for those reforms, when they have been won, to meaningfully advance the struggle. And that's the question that we want to address today. So as for what matters to people, in some sense, that's pretty straightforward. I mean, you're a person, so you probably know what matters to people. People want, meaningful and or fairly compensated jobs, and they want a voice at work, democracy in their workplace. They don't want to have to worry about food, healthcare, housing, and education. They want to be able to relax and explore the world and spend time with their loved ones. They want to live free of the fear of violence. They want to be able to enjoy and get the most out of, childhood, parenthood, retirement, and so on. So there's a wide array of reforms that can advance that very broad agenda. How do we pick the ones that we want to pursue? What's strategic? The second criteria that I listed can really help us answer that question. Like I said, we don't want to just fight for the stuff that matters to people. We also want to fight for stuff that, if we were to win it, would advance our side in the overall, centuries-long struggle to replace capitalism with socialism. The distinction between these two things, on the one hand, reforms that make people's lives better, and on the other hand, reforms that make people's lives better and also position us better to win more down the line. That's the central topic that concerns us today, is that distinction. Before we go any further, we should talk about this term that maybe has already popped into your head, which is reformism. It's true that reformism is a thing that we talk about on the socialist left, and it's a trap that we don't want to fall into. But we've got to be very clear about what reformism actually consists of before we start throwing that term around. It does not simply mean the pursuit of reforms, which by their very definition do not replace the capitalist system with a socialist system in one fell swoop. Instead, reformism is an orientation to reforms that imagines our ideal society as a certain number of discrete steps away, which means that each victory sort of inherently brings us a step closer to that ideal society. And it's a problematic way of thinking for a variety of reasons. One, it tends to lead to a fixation on reforms for their own sake, because each one is another step closer to utopia, and that can be sort of bad news for strategy, right? If because it essentially posits that every reform is equally good as every other reform, because they're all sort of like they're all getting us closer to where we want to go. There's also another problem being that we're outmatched. I mean, we're badly outmatched, our side, just by the nature of capitalism is sort of set up that way. We have power, but it's latent power, and we haven't organized it yet. And so for the time being, we are at the disadvantage. And that means that the gains that we make when we're following this model are tenuous, and they're subject to change and repeal, and they can be clawed back when conditions change, unless our reforms themselves make that harder, make that clawing back harder. So let me be super clear about this to summarize the previous section. To oppose reformism is not to oppose the struggle for reforms. The leading advocates of ending capitalism and replacing it with socialism, which is a very revolutionary prospect, were incredibly explicit that reforms would be part of making that revolution. Even Rosa Luxemburg, in Reform or Revolution, she really aims her fire primarily at reformism and reformists, and that's one of the texts from which we draw our tradition of critique of reformism. It's important in its own way. But even she writes this, take this to heart: the daily struggle for reforms, for the amelioration of the condition of the workers within the framework of the existing social order, and for democratic institutions, offers to socialists the only means of engaging in the proletarian class war and working in the direction of the final goal, the conquest of political power and the suppression of wage labor. Between social reforms and revolution, there exists for socialists an indissoluble tie. The struggle for reforms is its means, the social revolution its aim. I'm going to repeat that last sentence again. The struggle for reforms is its means, the social revolution its aims. So what about Karl Marx? I think that he tends to have a lot of revolutionary cred for good reason. I think he pretty famously advocated for a revolutionary end to capitalism and dawning of a new social order. Was he opposed to struggling for reforms, which by their very nature do not end capitalism? Not in the least, despite brimming with caution about reformism of his own. In fact, the political organization of which he was a leader for a while, the International Working Men's Association, had a platform. The platform was full of demands. The demands were for reforms. The reforms did not end capitalism. They were designed to strategically position the socialist movement better so that it could end capitalism, but they themselves did not end capitalism. A lot of these demands fell short of the full abolition of exploitative wage labor, and one of them that might be instructive for us to think about is the fight for the 8-hour day, which was really central to not only the International Working Men's Association, but indeed for all radical socialists in Europe and North America and Australia in the late 19th century. This was like the number one demand that was animating, in part because I think intelligent socialists were listening to workers and understood what they wanted, and in part because there was a fair amount of strategy that went into thinking about what it would have meant to win a demand like this. It's not only that it would galvanize people, which it did. I mean, you have to also remember that the 8-hour day was the impetus for the Haymarket riot, which resulted in the Haymarket affair. People literally, sacrificed their lives for the 8-hour day. There's no question that it galvanized people because it mattered to them and they wanted it. They wanted more time to spend with their families. They wanted more time to live their lives. But it was also the case, or at least the wager was on the socialist part, was that it was the case that it would dramatically change the landscape of class struggle once it was won. So in other words, it was a non-reformist reform. It was designed to transfer some resource, in this case, the resource of time, to working people to give them an opportunity to fight harder and win more. And if you've ever gotten off work at 5 o'clock and gone to a DSA meeting, there you have it. in order to further explain the difference between reformism and non-reformist reforms, I'm going to give you an analogy. So hopefully you've heard this before, but if not, I'm happy to spell it out. Marxists see class as relational, not gradational. You know, liberals see it as gradational. This is what we all grew up with. This is what we're familiar with. It's like liberals do recognize that we live in a class society. They understand that there are the haves and the have-nots. It's just that they see every individual as occupying their own distinct point on a gradient between the haves and the have-nots, all the way up and down, right? That's a gradational approach to class. It's very individualized. And it also, side note, leads to bad class analysis and lots of culture war nonsense, because you can sort of haggle forever over who occupies one little notch above or below, right? Marxists don't view class that way. Marxists actually view class as relational, which is to say it's a relationship of power. Marx himself and Marxists in general don't deny that there are, you know, other class positions besides the two main class positions in capitalism, the capitalists and the proletariat. But in general, we can see when we look around us that a lot of society is structured around that relationship between those two classes, which seem to sort of orbit each other like a binary star, or orbiting the same center of gravity, right? It's a relational way of thinking about class, not a gradational way of thinking about class. So the reason I'm bringing that up is because I think that we can imagine the struggle for reforms in a similar way. So progressives often sort of imagine their task as winning reforms cumulatively. I think that's kind of analogous to the idea that you can sort of put people, you can sort of scale people from the very bottom to the very top in terms of what class they occupy. It's like you can imagine reforms as being placed one in front of the other until we eventually get to the ideal society. It's all pushing us toward a better society in a gradient, if you will. So socialists, just as we imagine class differently from liberals, we also imagine reforms differently from liberals. Instead of accumulating them, we imagine ourselves as strategically using them to strategically intervene to change the relationship between the small ruling class and the vast majority of people who are oppressed and exploited by that class. So Andre Gores argued, and I am also arguing, that there are some reforms that position us better to square off with capitalism down the line and not get obliterated in the process, and that it's our responsibility to try to figure out what those are. A non-reformist reform or a structural reform, it can't simply be an improvement in the immediate state of affairs. It should be an improvement in the immediate state of affairs. It's not a reform if it doesn't improve things, right? But crucially, it has to involve a transfer of significant power from capital to labor. Power or resources, like for example, in the previous example, time. Time was the resource. We can and should argue about what does and does not constitute a good non-reformist reform. I don't think that there are hard and fast rules about that, but hopefully we can at least agree that there's a qualitative difference between a reformist orientation and this orientation, which is fundamentally about power. A more contemporary illustration of the concept of the non-reformist reform, which is maybe easier to wrap your head around just because we're living it, is Medicare for all. I think it's probably, it's not in a great place at the moment. I think we can all agree on that. But nevertheless, regardless of whether or not it's in a good place, well, first of all, I should say it's in a much better place than it was before. I think it was before Bernie Sanders' first run, I know it was idling around like 21% in favor of Americans were in favor of a single payer system. And then it shot up at some point, it shot up to 70%. I don't think it's at 70% anymore, but we could see that, you know, there's a lot of momentum behind this if only we can take advantage of it politically to like put our energy into this demand. I think, like I said, I think it's sort of, my time is up. I think it's our best approximation of the 8-hour-a-day demand for our present moment. And I'll tell you why. It's not just that it's a smart demand for socialists because it's a step in the right direction, though it is, or that it provides much needed relief and care for working people, though it does. It's that it transfers power. It's smart because it untethers access to a necessity, in this case, healthcare, from employment. So if unions don't have to make major sacrifices to protect health benefits, what else could they fight for? If a worker didn't have to worry about losing health insurance when they lose their job, how much bolder they could be in fighting their boss. If healthcare coverage is made independent from employment, how much less power would the bosses have over workers in the economy and politics in general? So I think you can see in that example what I mean by non-reformist reform. And I will end with just this one note to reiterate something I said before. And there are lots of other good examples out there. And I also want to caution that it's not the case that we, like I said, can say definitively whether a given reform does or doesn't qualify as a non-reformist reform or a structural reform, but it's our responsibility to debate among each other whether a given reform struggle qualifies. And if we're doing that, we're already advanced because we're no longer just thinking like good progressives trying to move the ball down the field. We're thinking like socialists who see it as our historic task to develop strategy and to mobilize and empower the working class to make it possible for ordinary people to fight harder and win the society that they deserve.